So we're going to start today then, kicking off a concept that we began in part in chapter 4. In chapter 4, we brought in the idea of bond polarity using electronegativity. And we came up with the concept that if we look at electronegativity differences, we can evaluate how evenly or unevenly electrons are being shared in a given bond. But one thing that we have to understand is that bond polarity does not necessarily dictate molecular polarity. And a great example of this is in carbon dioxide. In carbon dioxide, we have two polar bonds. We've got a carbon that is bonded to this oxygen, and we can see by their differences in electronegativity, the electrons are going to spend more of their time over here around the oxygen than they would around the carbon. And in a similar kind of fashion, we see that the other oxygen on the other side has a similar kind of dynamic. So if I looked at those bonds individually, I would say that those bonds are polar. But if I look at the molecule as a whole, I can see that as a whole, there is no polarity in this molecule. There is no place where I can point to in this molecule and say, okay, this is the positive side and this is the negative side. I can't do that. And the reason I can't do that is because the two bond dipoles that have been created are in completely equal and opposite directions of each other. All of the electron pull in this direction is being matched by all the pull in this direction. They're equal and opposite of each other. And so this is where the concept of molecular shape really becomes important to us. Because with molecular shape, now we start to see a concept of just how even or uneven that pull actually is. And do the dipoles that are created, do they work together to create an overall picture of polarity? Or do they clash with each other and effectively cancel each other out? So on an electron density map like this, what we would be looking for is we should find an area that is distinctively red or orange and has lots of electron density, and an area that's distinctively blue and green and has less electron density. I should be able to separate the two very easily by drawing a line between them. And if I can't do that, then what I'm describing is something that is nonpolar. So let's look at this as an example by comparison. Here I have water. Now in water, I can see that the net electronegativity differences show that overall electron density is pushing its way toward the oxygen. And if I drew it up using a set of connectors like these, what I would see is, first of all, I have my bent configuration here coming out of that tetrahedral. And the second thing I would see is that even though these are angled and directional, the left and right directions effectively cancel each other out. There is a net direction, however, upward toward the oxygen. And we call that the overall dipole moment, the overall direction of the electron pull. Electrons are being pulled upward toward the oxygen and its lone pairs in this molecule. And if I look at it from an electron density standpoint, I can clearly see there is an end here that has a net negative charge, and there is an end here that has a net positive charge. This is the molecule that we would describe as polar, because I have a negative end and a positive end in that molecule. And that sets that apart as different from the carbon dioxide that we looked at in the first example, because the carbon dioxide did not have any of that. There was no net negative and no net not positive. We had negatives at both ends and positive in the middle. And if it was bent, then we could say, okay, well, the negatives are on the bottom and the positive is on the top. But since it was completely linear and there was no distortion, then all that happened is that the negatives essentially canceled each other out. There's no net direction. So here's some look at some other examples here. Molecules that consist of two atoms, a heteronuclear bond, are going to be polar bonds. So hydrogen with chlorine, carbon with oxygen, hydrogen with fluorine, hydrogen with iodine, nitrogen with hydrogen. Those are all going to be polar molecules. What I want us to look at here is that there is something that is worthy of note. There is a trend here. Compare my two nonpolar molecules with an actual shape, nonlinear, with the two that are polar. What is it that the nonpolars have in common? What is it that the polars have in common? Jaron? Okay, yes. The nonpolars do all have poles in all directions. What else do we notice about the bonds themselves, the atoms that make up the bonds? In BF3, what are the types of bonds? Cameron? Well, it doesn't have to do with hydrogen. BF3, what kind of bonds are in BF3? What two atoms are bonded together? Ben? Okay. All three of these bonds are boron to fluorine. In carbon tetrachloride, all four of those bonds are carbon to chlorine. Now you may be looking at yourself and saying, okay, I think I see a trend here. Why is ammonia NH3 a polar molecule then? After all of those bonds are nitrogen to hydrogen. Again, here's where shape makes a difference. Notice the difference in shape between the boron trifluoride and the ammonia. This one is trigonal planar. This one is trigonal pyramidal. Ammonia is derived out of a tetrahedral. There's something missing, something that's not being shown here in the ammonia, and it's that lone pair of electrons. So when it comes to determining polarity, a molecule is going to be nonpolar if all of the bonds are of the same type of atom, and the shape has perfect symmetry in all three directions. So something like ammonia meets the first criteria, but it does not meet the second. The second criteria had to do with symmetry, and ammonia lacks one dimension of symmetry because in its tetrahedral shape, one of those positions is not a nitrogen to hydrogen bond. It's a lone pair instead. Why is methyl chloride polar? Well, it doesn't meet the first or the second criteria. In methyl chloride, not only do I have a different kind of bond, excuse me, I also have a different kind of electronegativity at the top of this tetrahedron. So even though these three bonds in the bottom of the pyramid are relatively nonpolar, the polarity of this bond, the extra electronegativity difference in this bond is going to create a distortion that is ultimately going to make this polar. I'm going to see a red region up here. I'm going to see bluish green regions down here. So let's go back through some of our examples and determine if they are polar or non-polar after all. And so if you have a modeling kit nearby, this is a good time to break that out because I think it's going to really help you to see that asymmetry when it exists. So if you recall, we drew on, I guess it was Monday, we drew the three-dimensional structure of selenium tetrachloride and it looked like that. Again, if you have your modeling kit, you're going to look for the trigonal bipyramidal shape, the one with the 5 peg holes in it. If you build it out, now my model kit's a little bit bigger. I chose this one deliberately because it's a little bit larger. But if you choose it, you end up with something that looks like this in 3 dimensions. Now we already determined this one had a steric number of 5, seesaw shape, less than 90 degree, less than 120 degree, less than 180 degree angles. Is this a polar molecule? Well, we got to put it up to the eye test. Do we have uniformity in our bonds? Yes. All 4 of the bonds are between selenium and chlorine. Is the molecule perfectly symmetrical? Now, in trigonal bipyramidal, symmetry is a little bit different. We talked about symmetry more in terms of, does it have symmetry in the axial direction and in the equatorial direction? If it does, then we can consider it to be symmetrical. In this case, we do have axial symmetry. These 2 bonds are the same. Any pull of electrons would cancel each other out in the axial direction. In the equatorial plane, however, we do not have symmetry. Even though these 2 bonds are equal and opposite to each other, the presence of this lone pair introduces an element of asymmetry. We would end up seeing a net dipole moment in the direction of that lone pair of electrons. Selenium tetrachloride is polar as a result. So any element of asymmetry, lone pairs included, would fit into that description. Lone pair would be certainly an example of that. If you recall, we also drew triiodide in our last session. We had iodine, bonded to iodine, bonded to iodine, and then we had lone pairs of electrons in the equatorial plane, and lone pairs of electrons all around those outer iodines. So again, if we build this out, we've got a linear shape coming out of that trigonal bipyramidal geometry. We have to ask ourselves the same kinds of questions. do we have symmetry in terms of the bonds that are present? Yeah. Both of the bonds here are iodine to iodine single bonds. We're good. Do we have molecular symmetry from a shape perspective? Again, with trigonal bipyramidal, it's a little bit different because we've got to evaluate equatorial versus axial. In the axial positions, do we have symmetry? Yeah. We got an iodine on top and an iodine on the bottom. In the equatorial plane, do we have symmetry? All three positions are occupied by lone pairs, so yes. So this is a symmetrical molecule. Even though we have pools of electrons going in the directions of the lone pairs, since they're all in the same equatorial plane, they're all 120 degrees apart, they all cancel each other out. The triiodide ion is a nonpolar molecule. Now it still has a charge. It's still going to attract positive ions. It is still likely to dissolve at least somewhat appreciably in water because of its negative charge. But does it have on its own a specified dipole in its covalent bonding? No. All right, for the next section here, just to refresh your memories, I'm going to draw out these four molecules. So answer the question, are they polar or nonpolar? Which ones are polar, which ones are nonpolar? If you need to model them out, go ahead and do so. Let's talk about it in a couple of minutes. All right, this is one of those concepts where once you kind of get the hang of it, it's you kind of wonder why you struggled with it for as long as you did. All we're looking for are elements of asymmetry. If we have any kind of asymmetrical element whatsoever, then we know that it has to be polar. So in the first one, PSCl3, this bond to sulfur is your asymmetrical element. Everything's bonded to chlorine except for up top. It's bonded to sulfur. Sulfur and chlorine have different electronegativities. They have different wants for electrons. That's going to create a little bit of distortion. It may not be a whole lot, but it's some. And that's all we're looking for here. Some. Do we have some distortion? Do we have some unevenness of sharing of electrons in the molecule itself? Phosphorus or PSCl3 is polar. In the case of IF4-, we can see that we have symmetry in that equatorial plane. All four of those bonds are all iodine to fluorine. And we have symmetry in this axial line as well. Lone pairs up and down. IF4-, nonpolar. IF4+, we have axial symmetry, iodine to fluorine up, iodine to fluorine down, but we do not have equatorial symmetry. That lone pair has a different electronic pull than these fluorines do. Net direction, it's going to pull toward that lone pair. This is a polar molecule. Same kind of thing in nitrogen nitrite ion. That lone pair is different than these oxygens. Net direction toward the lone pair, polar ion. So once you start getting good at looking for spotting those inconsistencies, those asymmetries, if you've got it drawn correctly in 3 dimensions, it becomes really easy to see, oh, that's polar, that's nonpolar. Without that, it does get a little bit more difficult. It is a little bit more trying. Any last questions about polarity? Okay. So we've spent all of this time up until now kind of getting into the what in terms of what happens when bonds form. What kinds of shapes do we see? What kinds of bond angles? What? The last part of this chapter explores why. Now, in terms of the last part of this chapter, if you try to read it in your textbook is going to get into something called molecular orbital theory. And while molecular orbital theory is technically the more advanced model, it's exactly that. It's more advanced. You've got to eat your Wheaties to really understand molecular orbital theory and understand it well. We're not going to approach it from that standpoint. So the majority of what you need for this part of the chapter is going to come largely from this set of notes and not from your textbook. You're not going to find a lot of this information in that textbook. They decided to go more from the molecular orbital standpoint, which again, we recognize that to be the better model, but it also requires more than a 10, 15-minute conversation to describe fully. The gist of it is this, though. We know that as we bring these atoms together, we are going to see overlap of their electron clouds. We've talked about that. It's the whole reason why the bond exists in the first place. The electron clouds overlap with each other, and we see a mutual attraction between the nuclei of one atom and the electrons of another. That's what makes a chemical bond a chemical bond. And in particular, a covalent bond a covalent bond. Problem is, there comes a point where they can get a little bit too close. If I put them too close together, their nuclei actually start to feel each other, and the nuclei start to repel each other. Hold them too far apart, and, well, the attraction really never gets off the ground. So there is a point, and that's what this energy diagram shows, a sweet spot, if you will, where the internuclear distance is kind of the most optimal. And this is largely what we call the bond length of the two. And so from that standpoint, we introduce an idea known as valence bond theory. In valence bond theory, what we are talking about is that the construct in order to create a covalent bond would require that I have a half-filled orbital from one atom intersecting with a half-filled orbital from another. Half-filled meaning it has one electron. So I've got one electron in an atomic orbital from this atom. I've got one electron in an atomic orbital from this atom. The two orbitals overlap. The two electrons are now sharing both spaces. And depending upon electronegativity, obviously one will spend more time in one area than the others. We define a sigma bond as a covalent bond that exists from that direct overlap of two orbitals. So I've got two orbitals. They are going to touch each other directly on that internuclear axis, so that space between the two atoms. And that's going to be our covalent bond. That is called a sigma bond. Sigma bonds are the strongest of covalent bonds because their attachment is the most direct. I'm getting very high interaction between the two nuclei in the space directly between them. Pi bonds, on the other hand, exist in a different kind of way. Pi bonding is parallel overlap bonding. So imagine I've got my two p orbitals here, and instead of overlapping directly like a sigma bond would, they're going to overlap in parallel. Now, they can't get this close to each other because in parallel, you got to consider that the nucleus is here in the middle. And to get them close enough to where they could actually overlap that way, we'd get the nuclei too close to each other. There'd be way too much repulsion. So what happens instead is they sit a certain distance apart, and the electron clouds kind of just hang over like a bridge between those two p orbitals. As a result, the majority of the electron density is not between the two nuclei, but rather above and below the two nuclei. As a result, pi bonds tend to be a little bit weaker. And their weakness ultimately means they cannot form on their own by themselves. They have to have a supporting actor, so to speak. That supporting actor is the sigma bond. Once the sigma bond establishes a relationship between the two, then we can see pi bonds adding on depending upon the need of the electrons. So more importantly, more specifically, where do we see pi bonding? Well, it's after the establishment of a sigma bond, which means we see a pi bond as a double bond or in a triple bond. So in all cases, all kinds of bonding start with sigma bonding, that direct overlap bonding that ties those two atoms together. So single bonds, double bonds, triple bonds all contain a single sigma bond. What makes a double bond is that it has that sigma bond as its base, and then it adds one of these pi bonds on top of it. What makes a triple bond is that we have the sigma bond as its base and two sets of pi bonds around it. One in one orientation, maybe above and below. Another in a second orientation, maybe in front and back. Again, they're electrons, they're going to repel each other to some degree. They can't all be in the same space. So even in pi bonding, we're going to see orientations to try to minimize some of that repulsion. But it always starts with that sigma bond. The sigma bond is the foundation of the chemical covalent bond. If more bonds are necessary, they can be added in as pi bonds. And we see pi bonding occurring with p orbitals in particular. Going to leave this as kind of our closing question. Something to think about going into Friday. Friday, we are going to close out this chapter once and for all. And we're actually going to get into and start chapter 6 a little bit with regard to talking about applications of what we just talked about today. What I want you to think about is this. I just presented to you this idea of valence bond theory, the idea of sigma bonds and pi bonds, the idea of overlapping orbitals in order to get bonding interactions to occur. With that in mind, how do we get to our hypervalent states? We talked about valence bonds. There are only 4 atomic orbitals. How do I get 5 overlapping orbitals out of 4 atomic orbitals? How do I get anything more than a couple bonds if I don't have any pi bonding? After all, we can see that S and P, if they're oriented in the right directions, can have that direct overlap of sigma bonding. But if I have P's in this orientation or P's in this orientation, they're not going to get close enough to each other outside of a pi bond. So how do I get to those tetrahedral shapes, to those trigonal bipyramidal shapes, to those octahedral shapes? So I want you to think about coming into Friday. Friday, we're going to have the answer. But I want you to puzzle on that for the next 48 hours. Have a good afternoon.